Where else do I want to go? For those of you tweeting, hopefully you can see a hashtag just there. Please use it. And what else? We ask that you do not make any sound recordings. Now, we will be recording what we call a lecture capture today. So that sort of captures what is on the screen and a very long distance view of the actual speaker themselves. Now, if there is any information that you would like to take from that, please ask myself or Bree Stitt, one of my administrators, and Jenna Rossi-Camus is somewhere around as well. She may be still outside doing some last-minute registrations. We'll see if we can help you with that. The filming is just for University of the Arts London students and staff, usually, but as I say, talk to us about it. At lunchtime, there's plenty of restaurants and Waitrose around the corner and sandwich shops on Regent Street. You're more than welcome to bring your sandwiches or whatever you would like back to the canteen space. That space is reserved to you all day. We also have, you may have noticed, a screen with some short clips of catwalk shows. Toilets, just the terrace to the, where am I? I'm left, this is your right. There's some toilets there, and also some toilets off the canteen. So if you go back out to the main corridor, 4 steps up, and there's a wooden door there. Now, without further ado, we hope you enjoy today's wonderful presentations. And I hand over to Matilda Pye to intro everyone.
Okay. So it's perfectly obvious I'm not Claire Wilcox. But sadly, Claire's had to go to Moorfields this morning because she's had a problem with her eyes. So I'm stepping in to just... Can I just quickly see how many people were at the conference yesterday? Quite a lot. Okay. Well, what I thought I'd do is I just wanted to quickly go through some of the things that happened yesterday. So unequivocally, we established, of course, that McQueen is an inspirational figure, and genius was flirted with on a number of guises. But undoubtedly, he inspired passion, absolute trust, and love in his collaborators. And it was wonderful to hear from Sam, Simon, Case, Susanna, and in the evening, Sarah Burton. And speaking with Sam Gainsbury, spoke with all these qualities in mind about making it happen, and the task of making it rain through electric lights, models walking in armadillo shoes over water, and making it happen for £600, £6,000, and figures that, will remain nameless. But she spoke eloquently about the journey from warehouses in Victoria through churches to Paris and beyond, following a wild imagination. Chris Breward explained the relationship between the male body and the tailored suit and the haptic experience of cloth as skin, which followed neatly into Tim Long's presentation, where he described the protective skin status of Chicago's wealthy elite, wearing McQueen as a badge of honor to actually show the inspiration and innovation that they wanted to show in their personality and in their business capacities. And he unpicked the geometry of McQueen's clothing, which through his deep knowledge of Charles James. And anyone who managed to see Sarah Burton in the evening, there was a kind of wonderful journey from all the sort of circles that Tim was imagining, and Sarah was actually showing pictures of exactly those circles that Edward Scissorhands-like McQueen would cut into. And then in the afternoon, we had a wonderful group of Renaissance scholars, early modern scholars, specialists in Gothic literature and luxury, who delved into the rich associations and readings in McQueen, creating a taxonomy of his passions as a designer, and the phenomenal visual literacy that McQueen had. And I think I was mindful throughout the day of McQueen being of a generation that I relate to, that is really pre-internet, and the mood boards and the extraordinary variety of visual material that he drew from was captured in a way that is no longer captured, that people research in a very different way now. And then, as we went on, we were able to, through Alistair McQueen, look at not just his relationship to visual imagery, but to moving imagery and the role of film, performance. And I think there was almost a sense where we could have, if we'd had a moment to go further, we could have thought about the explosion in the art world at the moment in which a lot of the most innovative shows were happening. Things like Serrano's Piss Christ was shown, and Bill Viola and the Chapmans, and there were a range of things that were happening that he was so obviously a part of. And then Anne Ray spoke beautifully and with passion about the relationships that he endeared and the faithfulness of his collaborators. And I think her beautiful films that she showed had a sensibility that was almost like the nature films that we know that he loved, and that we saw the fragility of the models moving between the behind-the-scenes space and then the show space. And I think she captured that in a sort of a wonderful, wonderful way. And then Simon Costin, again, was able to take us to a sense of what it was like and the kind of fun of being part of such an amazing team, an amazing man. We've got a wonderful day today, and I think we're perfectly set up to continue thinking about. We have Laura Morgan here, so we can actually begin to understand what it was like to actually be in those costumes, be in those clothing. And we're very much looking forward to hearing more from Case and from Caroline Evans. We can go deeper into the performativity and the networks that McQueen was part of with Keith Lodwick and Jane Pritchard. And then we're really excited that we have a number of London College of Fashion students who will be talking in the afternoon. And we will end on going into adornment through shoes, feathers, makeup. So without further ado, let's begin our day. And I welcome Caroline Evans. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. You need to mic me. Also, can you maybe go like that one? So, Matty, I'm going to rely on you to move us on if I lose sight of the time, because we're not quite on the same timetable as the program. So if I'm going on too long, or any of us are, just tell us to wrap it up. So it's very nice to be here. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about the research I did for my piece in the McQueen catalogue. Then Jane Munro from the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge is going to talk, who's the curator of a really brilliant exhibition last year about mannequins that's on in Paris now. She'll talk for 20 minutes. And then we're going to have, I think, about a half hour or 40-minute in-conversation with Laura and Case, which I'll be chairing. So that's the format. Okay. So this is a quote from McQueen, which, in fact, I used to open my catalogue essay. And McQueen did indeed have a very strong appreciation of craftsmanship. And what I want to do today is bring together two kinds of craftsmanship, to look a little bit at that of the many makers that he enlisted to produce some of his showpieces, particularly the bodices, and then to look at something which is not so often regarded as craftsmanship, and that is the craft of the models who brought these pieces to life on the runway. And these are two activities that may seem very different, making and modelling. But I think that both makers and models are engaged in the same kind of thinking through doing. And they do this through their engagement with the garment, with the object itself. And especially when it's a very highly crafted showpiece, it brings into dialogue a kind of embodied knowledge of their craft that both the maker and the performer have. I think McQueen's own craftsmanship, as we heard yesterday, lay particularly in his tailoring abilities. He had the Savile Row training, which teaches a kind of awareness of the frailties of the male body underneath the suit. And I think that's transposed here to this representation, if I can call it that, of the female body. It's a very typical way that McQueen had of framing the female body, the female torso, by this sharply cut jacket and the bumpster trousers that he claims he designed in order to lengthen the torso. And we heard about his interest in the spine, the body, and profile. as a way of designing. This is an early McQueen piece, an early collection, and he went on, I put it in really to show how he's got that interest in the body as torso right from the beginning. And I want to move on now to look at a series of constructed torsos that he went on to show. He went on to refine this idea, I think, in a series of bodices or corsets that were made really of anything but textiles, that sheathed the body in plastic, metal, wood, glass, crystal, shells, and leather are just some of the materials he used. And to do so, he enlisted the services of designers and craftsmen of all kinds, from jewelers to props makers and many other kinds. So Case, who we're going to be speaking to later, is one of those people. It's important to say that all the pieces I'm looking at today, these bodices were showpieces. They're garments that are designed to attract attention on the runway and the media rather than to be part of the selling collection. So I think they're performance pieces, really, perhaps more than they are fashion, if one can make that distinction. But of all the showpieces, I think it's perhaps the torso modelled in these hard materials like metal, glass, crystal, leather and wood, which have the most to say about the body beneath them, that make visible several complex contradictions between beauty and containment, femininity and fear, and empowerment and control. We heard a lot about empowerment yesterday, and that's something I want to come back to. But let me just talk a little bit about some of the techniques, just to give you a sort of picture of the range of techniques that he uses. So here he commissioned the designers Whittaker Malin to make this gold leather sort of Roman-style bodice, worn by the model Alec Weck in the show, but modelled here by Naomi Campbell. And really how this is made, what these designers do, is they construct a bodice, it's shoemaking principles, so they construct a bodice, they sculpt a bodice rather, a body form that is exactly like a shoemaker's last, and then they model the bodice on that, and you can see that as instructed they've put in some musculature, but it's essentially sculptural, whereas the next piece I'm going to show you is made by moulding. It's a different technique and it produces a really different look. So they sculpt this torso like a last, and then they cut out the pattern pieces and they transfer them onto this suede-lined leather and stitch it, and finally they gild it. Whereas 2 years later, for his own label, number 13, McQueen presented a series of bodices with a very different aesthetic. I don't know if you can spot the not deliberate mistake. I only realized after I put this together that one of these pictures must be reversed, because obviously the arm would be the other side, if you see what I mean, this one. So I'm sorry about that. I'm kind of not clever enough with PowerPoint to be able to flip it, and I'd done it by then. Anyway, so these bodices were made by prosthetists who are experts at designing and fitting artificial limbs at Queen Mary's Hospital in Roehampton. And they're created by wet moulding leather over a plaster of Paris body cast that was supplied by McQueen. So the result is this bodice that actually bears the imprint of the naked body. So you have this indented navel, faint nipples, the angular jut of shoulder blades, and the slight suggestion of a rib cage. So that whereas McQueen asked Whittaker Malin to create a sort of six-pack and a navel for that gold Givenchy bodice that you saw before, you have an entirely different kind of look, because it was sculpturally modelled and stitched rather than moulded from a life cast. And the Givenchy bodice really evoked the marble torsos of classical antiquity, in keeping with the theme of that show, whereas these number 13 pieces have medical connotations augmented by this asymmetrical corset lacing that resembles a suture, and the high necks that recall a surgical brace. The corset was worn in the show by this model, the double amputee Paralympic athlete and performer Amy Mullins, who walked on wooden legs of hand-carved elm. But it's actually based, it's not Amy Mullins' body. If I can talk about you in this way, it's Laura's body. So Laura and Case are going to be talking about this, but this is the actual cast body that Case cast of Laura. And I'm going to leave them to talk about it. But I just want to make the point that a whole range of bodices over several years were actually made using this cast and were modelled by many models other than Laura. In fact, as Erin O'Connor sort of said to me, that was the only time I ever had boobs, and it was somebody else's body. So I'll just show you a few examples. This is another piece cast, again, the same session, another piece cast by Case of Laura. but you can see how it's been used to create this sort of hip brace piece that was worn by Shalom Harlow in the same show. And then moving on to look at some other pieces, also made on Laura's body cast. This Givenchy ready-to-wear for a sort of cyborg bodice in red leather with a kind of white prosthetic-style trim. And McQueen continued to use this over several years. I'll just show you one example from It's Only a Game, 6 years later. And you can see again there are sort of traces of the body, but it's hugely sculpted obviously at the hips. And Case, I think, will also talk about several clear vac-form torsos that you make, but so I'm going to leave that for them and move on. This is a piece that was modelled by Laura and on her body cast. So it's from the Overlook, and it's a coiled metal corset by the jeweller Sean Lean. And Lean recreated McQueen's typical torso shape in this metal body brace made in shiny aluminium, which has a high neck and short sleeves that slightly restrict the arm movements and force the chin up and propel the gaze forward. Lean said that it was technically the hardest thing he'd ever done. He was actually trained as a goldsmith, was used to working in fine metals on a very small scale, and like many people who worked for McQueen, reported that it wasn't that he pushed them, but somehow there was some kind of alchemy or chemistry that made them push themselves and achieve in ways that they didn't think they could. So he had to teach himself new metal skills and to work at a new scale. So each of these coils was made one by one, and he fitted them individually to the plaster of Paris torso that I showed you earlier to ensure a precise fit. He said that the bust area was particularly difficult. He just had to rely on trial and error and keep changing it. And even working a 16-hour day, he could only make 8 coils a day. And the finished corset consists of 90 coils. So it's physically, he said, very, very demanding work, and the entire corset took 6 weeks to complete. It's also, as I know Laura will be able to tell us, quite hard to get into. So this is a picture of Laura actually being fitted on the left. And I wanted to show you, to draw your attention to the openings at the side, because it took literally 15 minutes to put the model into this garment, because she had to be carefully screwed into it by means of a series of minuscule screws that ran down both sides of the corset. And when she modelled in the show, I remember you saying to me that the fit is so precise that you could feel your chest against the metal when you breathe. So this is Laura being fitted for it. 15 minutes to get in, 10 minutes to get out, and this is her modelling. And again, I'm sure we'll come back to talk about that. Just one more example. Erin O'Connor in this winged bodice by Simon Kenny, made of plywood, birch plywood. Sorry, that one actually should have gone earlier, so we'll move on. This is a red glass corset, worn again by Laura Morgan, probably based on her body cast, and made by Columbia Glassworks in East London, made for the Voss collection. So all of these torsos are very powerful objects in their own right. Another fit model, Paulina Kashina, told me that all the looks are powerful, but especially the last few, the showpieces. They have a very strong auratic power even off the body, and I think that may be why the Cabinet of Curiosities section in the exhibition is so strong. But animated by the models in the shows, they became even more powerfully suggestive. Certainly they require a kind of chutzpah, a certain attitude, and even physical bravery, because a model in a glass corset knows she can't afford to fall. And I remember, as Laura said to me, that someone said jovially, well, if you trip, you're a goner. But actually, all the models I interviewed described experiences like this not with fear, but with amusement and admiration. Even when they said they were scary or terrifying, adjectives like that, they used them as accolades. And Erin O'Connor affirmed that modelling for McQueen was never fear-driven, as she put it, even in the case of the most extreme show pieces. So these descriptions bring to mind the concept of the French sociologist Bruno Latour, his idea of objects as having agency, objects that are capable of making something happen. And the most obvious example, perhaps in fashion, of an object with agency might be a high-heeled shoe that changes the gait, such as these armadillo shoes from Plato's Atlantis, or something like this body sculpture by Sean Lean, which is a sort of armature you can see at the waist of the model, but it also goes up her back and along inside the jacket so that she physically, her arms are forced into this kind of position. Those are, if you like, the physical limitations of the design from which she then begins to make her performance. And this might sound like a mechanistic account, I suppose, of objects having agency that simply restrict motion. And in some ways, I suppose it could be said to be so. Amy Mullins recalled that when she was modelling in this show, she had actually practiced her model walk before the show, but she couldn't use it because the carved elmwood legs that she wore had no flexibility in the ankle. They weren't like the prosthetic legs she'd had commissioned for herself for running, for example, or even for daily use. And also she'd planned her route to avoid these circular turntables in the floor. But of course, once she was in this corset, her chin was so high that she actually couldn't look down and see the floor. So you have to improvise. You have to work with those limitations at the last minute. You have to trust your instincts, as she put it. And these very typically McQueen designed devices produce a kind of hard grace. The chin impossibly high, the gaze resting on an imaginary horizon, and a rigid torso that allows no more flexion, as Paulina Kashina said, than a snaky sway. She said you can't move much, but you can sway from side to side a bit. And it alters the forward thrust, of course, of each high-heeled step as well. So it's a very disciplined, uncompromising body with nothing free-form, in a sense, about it. And McQueen's models often do look fierce and almost like soldiers with this very determined gait and fierce gaze. And it brings to mind the work of the French historian Georges Figarello, who's described a range of historical phenomena, including etiquette lessons and the corset in the early modern period, as a kind of pedagogy of the body. In other words, that the corset schooled the body to a certain behavior. He writes about these things as forms of physical and moral training that produce a specific carriage and gait. And something comparable could certainly be argued for McQueen's high-neck bodices and restraining jewellery. Catherine Brickhill, who was assistant designer at McQueen and Givenchy from 1995 to 2001, said, and I quote, "You're being worn by Lee's clothes. You're not wearing them, but you're worn by the pieces." But I think it would be a mistake to interpret Brickhill's statement simply as a kind of mechanical account or a sort of deterministic account of how much clothing produces action. And certainly when I put this point to all the models I interviewed, they vehemently disagreed with me, including Laura, who was very eloquent about how commanding the clothes were and how proud they made her feel to wear. And in fact, all the models I spoke to argued that the clothes and the shows gave them a degree of creative freedom that they felt that other designers' more conventional clothes didn't, despite the physical skills required to wear McQueen clothes, perhaps because of them. So although McQueen's manipulations of the torso might be seen as Pygmalion-like, moulding women's bodies to his whim, the model's account of wearing them were always scripts of empowerment. And Erin O'Connor, shown here, describes how this dress inspired her to a particular kind of performance, a form of play acting or fiction that Latour describes as a catalyst for the agency of the object. So Latour writes that not all objects do have agency. He says, I quote, "Specific tricks have to be invented to make objects talk, that is, to offer descriptions of themselves, to produce scripts of what they're making others, humans and non-humans, do." And Latour lists many such catalysts, things like the archive, the museum archive, but the final one, he says, is creative fiction, because, as he writes, sociologists like himself have a lot to learn from artists. And I think here one could argue for McQueen's creative concept for the show as a kind of script, exactly that kind of script or fiction that generates a particular performance transcending the physical limitations of the clothes. Or perhaps I think transcending is not right, actually. It's about working with them, because they're not really anything that needs transcending. Furthermore, it was on the runway that McQueen, the technician of materials and of making, fashioned a space for the technicians of the immaterial, the models whose performance would give life to the showpiece through the walk, the pose, the gesture, and the cultivated attitude. So in this sense, one can begin to think of the models as technicians of the walk, just as the makers are technicians of the object. And I think McQueen really got the craftsmanship of modelling. He really cared about the shows. He really wanted clothing to come to life. And he really saw the models as doing that. I mean, witness yesterday's account, in fact, by Sam Gainsbury, of how he spoke to every girl before she went out and convinced her actually that she wouldn't fall in those impossible shoes and that impossible set. So in suggesting that the model's bodily movement is a technique, I am using the term in the sense employed by Richard Sennett on his book, The Craftsman, where he talks about technique considered as a cultural issue rather than as a mindless procedure. So if there is a technology of the body, it's not deterministic, as these examples of modelling difficult showpieces have demonstrated, I hope, but taking its cue from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, a kind of technology linked to poetry. In the fashion show, a kind of poetry in motion, because for Heidegger, and I don't have time to go in depth into his long article or chapter on technology, but essentially for him the essence of technology is nothing technological, and he begins in fact to link it to craft and to poetry. And far from being merely mechanical or instrumental, technology, he argued, was a way of revealing something poetic that could be discerned especially in the work of craftsmen or artists. Now, as I said earlier, fashion modelling isn't usually talked about in terms of craftsmanship. Although actors, of course, often talk about their craft. But the term is more generally associated with hand-making and with expert workmanship in materials, something McQueen, of course, was highly attuned to when he chose to work with other designers and makers. And that he also had a good instinct for the right model for the job suggests he recognized their craftsmanship too. Because although making and modelling are very different types, as I suggested at the beginning, it's striking how similarly both designers and models have described the way he enabled them to push themselves in new directions. Both making and modelling require a high degree of skill, commitment, and judgment. But craftsmanship, Richard Sennett argues, going down to my bottom quote now, extends further than that. The craft of making physical things provides insights into the techniques of experience and ways of using tools, organising bodily movements, thinking about materials that are viable proposals about how to conduct life with skill. So both the designer who works in materials and the fashion model who works with movement can be argued to be making this kind of a proposal. And it was on McQueen's runways that the craft of making the showpieces and the craft of modelling them came together. McQueen's fashion shows thus stage an encounter between the agency of the object and the agency of the model, a kind of distributed agency between the human and the non-human, as Latour would have it. Erin O'Connor, shown here in Voss, felt that in modelling McQueen showpieces, I quote, "We weren't wearing objects, they became part of us, who we were. It was very much a performance, and I understood that. I found it really thrilling and liberating all at once, and the more daring and bold the idea, of course the showpieces were all impossible and should never have happened, the more we absolutely got stuck in and made it so." And her claim that clothing actually became a part of the models is an instance of what the phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty called being a thing, which of course doesn't mean being objectified so much as immersing oneself or losing oneself in an activity. So that in Sennett's words, we're so absorbed in the craft of what we're doing that we've become the thing on which we're working. Like makers and designers who work with material culture, fashion models have an embodied knowledge of what they're doing, which Sennett calls the unity of head and hand, although he doesn't write about fashion modelling. When O'Connor says, "You know when you've nailed it, it's a feeling, and physically your body allows you to know that," she's articulating exactly this point. The phenomenon of immersing oneself in a skilled activity produces a paradox, however. It involves both extreme precision or focus and extreme abandonment to the moment. So, have I got time to make my last point? It's just the last slide. Okay. So I think ultimately, perhaps one thing that does differentiate making from modelling is that the craft of modelling really lies in its unscripted nature. No rehearsals, minimal walkthroughs, and the requirement to nail it instantaneously means that the model has to trust her or his instinct. Like the jazz musicians described by Sennett in his book on craftsmanship, fashion models have to anticipate, improvise, and select freely but within a certain structure. So even when O'Connor, shown here right in the center, modelling in this show, became entangled by balloon strings on this merry-go-round, here she is, she's actually stuck. She's stuck there for 20 minutes. And she had to pose for 20 minutes, and all the other models, when they came around, tried as part of the performance to sort of undo her. Were you in this, Laura? Yeah. So you can tell us about it. Okay. But basically, I guess that's what the job demands, isn't it? And unlike those craftsmen in materials who over many weeks meticulously and expertly craft metal, glass, and leather, fashion models work with raw materials that are immaterial and immediate. Intuition, improvisation, adrenaline, and gut reaction. So more of that I hope we hear about later. Thank you all very much.
It's just forward and backwards. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk at a conference which is not in my normal run of art historical and museum type of conferences, and it's all the more exciting and challenging to be able to think about a subject I've been working on for 6 to 10 years, which has resulted in this show that Caroline mentioned at the Fitzwilliam and now in the Musée Bourdelle in Paris, called Silent Partners, Artist and Mannequin from Function to Fetish. And it was a challenging and really very interesting for me to think about McQueen in that context, and that's really what I want to address today. So it's not the fact of being myself a Highlander and a daughter, as well as a daughter of a widow of Culloden, that drew me to the theme of atrocity in McQueen's work as part of this talk, even though some of the designs that of that collection do summon up for me memories of that bleak heather moor in powerfully elusive ways. As I don't need to emphasize to you, Highland Rape is only one of a number of collections McQueen designed that explored notions of atrocity, death, violence, or aggression, although, as the exhibition makes clear, he conceived of aggression he conceived of what others perceived as aggression in the spirit of Romanticism. And of course the body, or rather what McQueen created of the body, which we've heard a bit about from Caroline, as much as the clothes, played a key role in communicating that sense of violence and violation. And that's what I'd like to explore today. The catalogue of the current exhibition quotes a number of McQueen's models, including Laura, on the physically and psychologically transformative experience of modelling his clothes, referring to them as blank canvases or as having personae that were reinvented by McQueen as a creator, to quote Naomi Campbell. McQueen's vision of his own work as adhering to tradition but breaking the rules is often quoted, and this seems to me no less true of the way he uses mannequins and models, and in some cases suggestively fuses the two. So from the one hand, you get, as in the Givenchy show in 1999, his notion of injecting a suggestion of life to a collection of plastic mannequins by making them revolve and having throbbing light emanate from within, or on the other, manipulating models to look like different forms of gynoid mannequins, articulated dolls, automata, through a combination of makeup, lighting, and sometimes headgear that obscures the face, so eroding a sense of identity and humanity. As I'll aim to show this tendency to blur boundaries between the animate and the inanimate, and to unsettle the viewer by the doubt it injects into our viewing and our reading of the human or humanoid figure, has a prehistory in artistic terms that dates back to at least the 19th century. And significantly, in terms of today's talk, it's also one that draws on the idea of the artificial body as both the victim and purveyor of atrocities. Yes, like the famous Chapman, Great Deeds Against the Dead, and the mannequins that are purveyors of atrocities in the video game Silent Hill. The intellectual doubt arising from the difficulty in distinguishing whether a particular figure is a real person or an automaton is, of course, one of the distinctive features of the psychologist Ernst Jentsch's definition of the uncanny in his essay of 1906. Although Freud would later reject this and attribute the sense of uncanny to an infantile terror of castration. Whatever their differences, both drew on the anti-rational, supernatural, and willfully romantic writings of the German author E.T.A. Hoffmann, and in particular his story of The Sandman in 1816. It's a story of a young student, Nathanael's love for a mechanical doll, Olympia, which culminates in the doll's destruction, Nathanael's descent into madness and eventual suicide. Hoffmann's story, of course, had a long afterlife, notably in the theatre, translated into Delibes' ballet Coppelia, and also very famously into Offenbach's Tales of Hoffmann, the original performance, Adèle Isaac and Jean-Alexandre Talazac on the left, and a more recent 2012 production in South Florida Opera Company on the right. And it was one of these, its 20th century stagings by Max Reinhardt in Berlin in 1931 that became one of the key influences on Hans Bellmer's construction in 1933 to 34 of the first of his life-size pubescent female figures made of fragmented parts, now destroyed, which he described as an artificial girl with anatomical possibilities, capable of recreating the heights of passion, even to inventing new desires. And as we'll see rather later in the talk, La Poupée, of course, was a source of inspiration for McQueen's 1997 collection, and I'll come back to that. But before looking specifically at the fashion or display mannequin, I wanted first to look at its close cousin, the history of the making and development of the artist mannequin or lay figure. For McQueen, as for painters and sculptors from the Renaissance onwards, the mannequin was, of course, also and essentially a tool. On the screen you see two works by Fra Bartolomeo and Leonardo da Vinci. Fra Bartolomeo is the artist mentioned by Vasari as having had made a life-size wooden figure on which he modelled drapery, clothing, armour, and such like things. He passed into history as the inventor of the mannequin. It's not actually true, but he is the sort of point of reference in the Renaissance taken in terms of artists' use of mannequins. Though it lacked the pliability and the give of human flesh, it provided a conveniently immobile form which was capable of maintaining a pose for longer than a living model and without the aid and doubtless uncomfortable external supports, such as this poor lady's having to endure. Over the centuries, lessons on drapery studies became institutionalized as part of the curriculum in artist training, and private artists who could afford to buy or rent mannequins, because they were seriously expensive pieces of equipment, would often spend the best part of a day arranging drapery and clothing and only a fraction of that time drawing it. Eventually, it led to the demand for mannequins that simulated human form with far greater degrees of accuracy, prompting mannequin makers from the 18th century onwards, nearly always called mechanics, to come up with ever more ingenious ways of replicating the appearance and movement of the human body, transforming what was dismissively referred to as a nasty contraption into what one maker in 1839 described as the perfect imitation of the human machine. Paris became the leading centre of artist mannequin making, producing what became known as the naturalistic or perfected mannequin, a figure with an internal skeleton with articulations that were designed to move ever more fluidly, such as this armature from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. You'll note it's got 2 arm bones rather than a great lump of wood, for example. And others, lots of patents taking out, using more new materials like rubber to make their figures move more and more fluidly. This guy said that his mannequin was better because it could touch its knee with its nose and it could kick its bum with its heel. So, it's an amazing amount of effort to go to for something that's actually supposed to be fixed in position and not move. So there's all sorts of contradictions in this story, which I love. It was also, the perfected mannequin also had a padded and painted exterior known as the garniture, which was bulked out by horsehair or coir and covered with silk stockinette to resemble exterior curves like breasts, stomachs, calf muscles, and so on. And this is by the mannequin maker of the early 19th century, Paul Huot, a rare surviving example in Kassel. But there is another contradiction, which is, although the majority of artists came to use them, if they didn't actually own one, caution was also always advised, because overusing them could actually destroy the effects of naturalism they set out to achieve through using them. And if that happened, the painting was said to stink of the mannequin or the studio, and the bodies in it became mannequinized, which is a term really based on something that Diderot said in one of his commentaries in the painting. For all their perfectedness, it's important to remember that they were really always intended to remain invisible. But from the beginning of the 19th century, artist mannequins, and notably the padded variety, were outed and started appearing in paintings and comic scenarios to begin with. But as the century progressed, they became increasingly permeated with sometimes troubling erotic undercurrents, as artists and photographers explored how their precarious partnership with the mannequin played out behind closed studio doors. But more broadly, the mannequin and its artificial kin, wax figures, automata, dressmakers' dummies — this is a shot I took in Kassel when I went to see the Huot mannequin — came to occupy an increasingly significant place as literary or dramatic personae in a variety of genres, from comic burlesque to tales of the uncanny and so-called technological novels that were a byproduct of the profound changes associated with the industrialization and secularization of European society in the final decades of the 19th century. I've mentioned Hoffmann, but many other writers like the realist Champfleury, Edgar Allan Poe, who, as we know, was an influence in McQueen also, and at the end of the 19th century, the French writer Anatole France elaborated stories of madness, sexual desire, and destruction around artificial female forms. One of the leading protagonists, of course, and the victim in France's wickerwork woman, is most specifically defined as a dressmaker's mannequin. In the novel, it comes to symbolize everything that the professor of literature, Monsieur Bergeret, finds odious and grotesque in his wife's character, and like her, an unwelcome intrusion into his life of the mind. Eventually, he vents his fury on the figure and sets about crushing it, snapping each of its artificial ribs, stamping it underfoot, and chucking it into the courtyard below. Anachronistically, images such as this photograph by Herbert List come to mind. Perhaps the most famous of the so-called technological novels is the French writer Villiers de l'Isle-Adam's Future or Tomorrow's Eve, begun in 1878 and published in 1886, which is widely regarded as the first science fiction novel. The plot is too intricate and complex to elaborate in any detail here, but basically concerns the masculine construction of an ideal woman, here by a fictional Thomas Edison at the request of his friend Lord Ewald. And Ewald's aim was to preserve the looks of his current beloved, Alicia, but to upgrade her somewhat coarsened and insensitive soul. The transformation lasted a mere 21 days and took place through a process which was part technological, part mystical, and described by Villiers as transubstantiation, which had also an element of the then fashionable hypnosis thrown in. And the result was the creation of a female android called Hadali. Android is actually a term invented by Villiers. And like so many artificial creatures and their inventors, Hadali ends up being destroyed, in this case at sea, when returning with her creator Edison from the United States to England. And there's something that, by a similarly fantastic leap of the imagination, I thought was not impossible to imagine the android Hadali resurrected from her watery grave at the end of the novel and transformed into one of the models or the mannequins in Plato's Atlantis. If nothing else, Hadali's death through drowning, as it were, is natural, but more often the mannequin features as the target of wanton aggression, being the perfect victim, guaranteed to remain silent. This is perhaps natural in its own way, since the mannequin, and whether the artist or the designers, is itself prone to both use and abuse in the studio or workshop, and it's far more common to see a battered one than a pristine one. In pictorial terms, one of the most striking and one of the earliest explorations of this notion of body, artifice, and atrocity is this remarkable picture. Big, really, when you look at it, but it's got the most incredible force. Now, there's a lot to say about this, so I won't, don't worry, but it does, what Degas does on one level here is to show us that art is about artifice. So this person, Henri-Michel Lévy, is a painter who painted out of doors. So what does he show us? He shows us his out-of-door pictures in the studio. And the lady propped up against the tree in the background is, of course, modelled on this artificial model, which is slumped at his feet. So he's at one level saying, showing that art is composed of artifice. But he's also showing that that rather like in Darwinian terms, there's a flip side to evolution, which is degeneration, which I'm sure McQueen got from looking at collections I've seen that are clearly influenced by Darwin, that there's a flip side to creation, and that is of destruction. And since the mannequin, which is slumped at his feet, he looks out, and as one writer on Degas said, he's pushed into a corner. We don't know how to read it, but he sows a seed of doubt, and that's what's troubling. And this mannequin, since its manipulability depends on it being composed of different parts, it's very easy to evoke ideas of dismemberment and dislocation and destruction. And in fact, it's the body that can be taken apart and the overlap with other forms of body building, body making, like prosthetics, which Caroline mentioned, is very much part of the history of mannequin making, since the first mannequin owned by the Royal Academy in London was made by the man who also made Josiah Wedgwood's wooden leg. So the violence meted out against the mannequin in Degas' painting may seem tame by comparison with the grotesque deformation of Belmer's dolls half a century later. But the figure of the mannequin also points to a visual prototype for that suggestively eroded boundaries between real and artificial bodies. And that is the relationship with these records, these photographic records of female patients at La Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, compiled by the collaborators of the so-called Napoleon of Neurosis, the clinical neurologist Jean-Marie Charcot. Charcot was chief physician at La Salpêtrière from 1862 until his death in 1893. And he was one of the most prestigious and celebrated doctors of the day who were treating hysteria. He held weekly public demonstrations that were attended by a broad section of the great and the good, as well as medical practitioners such as the young Sigmund Freud. And it was perhaps his solid reputation that allowed him to deal with the skepticism surrounding hypnosis as a form of medical investigative procedure. To give it scientific credibility, Charcot broke down the hypnotic state into several definable phases: lethargy, catalepsy, and somnambulism. Now, catalepsy was particularly interesting in artistic terms because it allowed the body to be manipulated into different positions and retain them for long periods of time, otherwise humanly impossible. In this state, Charcot said, the body became remarkably favourable to aesthetic studies. Others, like the novelist Jules Clarty, made similar comparisons, liking the female cataleptic's brain to soft wax, ready to have its feelings moulded by the doctor, who in these texts is often called the operator as well. While for Léon Daudet, the manipulable cataleptic's body resembled nothing less than the artist's mannequin, only more docile and flexible. I show this image of a cataleptic from the Nouvelle Iconographie, produced by Charcot and his followers, alongside this image from La Poupée, which Caroline also showed. So a body and a mind that were both out of control and controllable was, of course, an endangered one, vulnerable to exploitation, and numerous medico-legal treaties of the late 19th century recognized and recorded cases of rape and other forms of violation against mostly female patients. But it was also a dangerous body, which was capable under suggestion of carrying out unspeakable crimes and atrocities, a vision that accorded well with that of the femme fatale, an insentient android devoid of feelings and a moral sense. As such, and this again is returning to these notions of empowerment, it became a body that was not diminished through disability, but empowered by its own deformation, and in a way which I think is very interesting to think of in terms of McQueen's construction of personae in his models and his shows. So so far I talked mostly about the artist mannequin, but would like to end by bringing us closer to McQueen, looking at fashion or display mannequins. Having said that, there isn't actually much between the two. The main function of both was to support clothes, though in the case of the display mannequins, there was also always less of an emphasis on movable articulations or mobility, and again, what Caroline was saying about the bodice is very interesting in that respect. Some of the earliest purpose-built display mannequins, in fact, this is an 1895 catalogue from Stockman, are very similar, as you see, to these padded dolls, notably the guy cycling, and came significantly with detachable heads. And these ones could let you transform the figure into an old man, an Englishman, a Chinese, a Negro, quote, etc., etc., etc. Oh, and an eccentrique, so weirdos as well at the end. You could buy a special weirdo head if you like. And the mannequins were also docile, subservient creatures, at least according to Léon Riotor in this strange and really wacky book of 1900, which is about one of the very, very few in the development of the fashion mannequin in Paris. Elements of the manufacture of the earliest forms of these, the corseted buste, invented by Alexis Lavigne, the founder of Esmod, and continued by Stockman, became themselves often fetishistic inspiration for artists and writers. And what you see here, Moulage sur Nature, is the I'm sure that our other speakers will have a lot to say about parallels with this. But the body is painted with this form of wax and glue, and then it's taken apart and reassembled into these busts, these different bust forms, and they have different dates of them, so they are always up to date, as it were. So they became themselves often fetishized inspirations for artists and writers, so that in the last decades of the 19th century, for example, the tight cinched waists emphasizing the breasts elicited lustful, erotic responses from the decadent author Joris Karl Huysmans, who in his Croquis Parisien drooled over the mannequins in Stockman's shop in the Rue Le Gendre in Paris, detail of which you see in the screen. This is actually just from the front of one of their trade catalogues, describing it as a waxwork museum of breasts that provoked in him licentious dreams at the sight of ephebic teats or ripe bosoms. And of course, this sort of aspect was parodied by surrealists like Maurice Henry, Dali, Houellebecq, and others in the so-called Mannequin Street at the International Exhibition of Surrealism in Paris in 1938. And those of you who have studied McQueen's work will, of course, and from what Caroline said as well this morning, will sort of see this inversion in this bodice, among others, so that where Stockman molded it in order to use as display, this is created, the shape and this is superimposed rather than moulding and becomes part of the piece rather than being used to display it. Like the artist figure, Paris became the key centre for the manufacture of display figures in the first decades of the 20th century, with specialist firms such as Pierre Immense and Siegel exporting throughout the world. They followed a similar trajectory to that of the perfected artist mannequin, that is, moving to more and more realistic appearances. But the way the firms achieved this differed. So the Dutch-born maker Pierre Immense, who introduced breathing mannequins. I have never found one of these, but they seem incredible. They're in catalogues and they sound incredibly spooky. And these ones, les mannequins lumineux, which glowed from within, resonance of the Givenchy show that we looked at the beginning of the talk. Whereas Siegel took another approach and had a more stylized mannequin and wanted to suggest their realism through their modernity, so had them photographed by people like Hoeniger Heine and Man Ray for his catalogue, in the same way as they were photographing real models for Vogue and other magazines, so there was that blurring of boundaries. Now, Immense trained with one of the modelers from the Musée Grévin waxwork museum in Paris, and was best known for his extremely lifelike wax mannequins, which he actually stopped calling mannequins. They were les cires of Pierre Immense. And they often had pert expressions and gestures and perfectly coiffed hair and contextualized in social settings, which gave them implied certain wealth or social status. And most female mannequins also, like Lydia and Maud, had names. I particularly like Maud, the idea of playing with her dolls. The artistic pretensions of these mannequin makers, who claimed that their figures were actually not mannequins, they were créations artistiques, were mocked by the surrealists and others. But before then, they were targeted by another reviewer, by various reviewers and writers. One reviewing the exhibition of modern decorative and industrial art held in Rouen in 1923, which was intended as a testing ground for the great Art Deco exhibition in Paris 2 years later, launched a virulent attack on the mannequins used to display designer clothing in the dress section. And he must have meant Immense, because he refers to wax mannequins. Of all atrocities, this reviewer ranted, the wax mannequin is surely the most objectionable. Not only was it unable to effectively display the subtleties of the cut or fabric, it was essentially inhuman, he wrote, a parody of the human figure, a parody which is bizarre and horrible because it's always a parody of death. So, and just as the Stockman figures reminded Huysmans of the morgue at the same time as they aroused him, so these figures brought this reviewer's mind to thinking about what he called the sanctum of evil, which was the chamber of horrors at Madame Tussauds. Now, if the stench of the mannequin was also, to an extent, the stench of death, it could be a gift to the artist, so that people like Walter Sickert, this is his mannequin now called George, which usually lives in the basement of Baspar University. He saw it as the ideal model for the not yet risen Lazarus, and painted 3 versions of that painting, one of which is on the image on the screen. George was evidently a compliant model, but in other cases the mannequin became the subject of deliberate and symbolic abuse. One of the most notorious cases is that of Oskar Kokoschka, who had made by a dressmaker in Munich a life-size doll of what he hoped would be what he hoped would be the image and also the touch, because he goes into great details in his letter explaining what this figure should feel like, of his ex-lover, Alma Mahler. Now, the doll was completed in 1919 and was said to have been paraded variously in various situations around Dresden, but then was destroyed at a drunken champagne party in 1922, when it was ritually beheaded and red wine poured over its neck. I gather the police were called, if you read the description. This is Alma herself, of course, at the bottom left, sadly decapitated. It wasn't entirely successful because his attempt at destruction lives on in some of his paintings. Now, decapitation is, of course, a ritual with symbolic and religious connotations. which are sadly more resonant than ever today. In most classical societies, both Eastern and Western, the head was understood to be the seat of the life force and the soul. Importantly, too, in this context, there was a belief that the male ejaculated with a fluid from the brain, so that, if not exactly a reproductive organ, it was also understood as a generative force. As Hélène Roberts puts it, to decapitate one's enemy was more than simply killing him or her. Rather, this act allowed the decapitator to have control over the severed head, which signified the power, vitality, soul, vision, and speech of the now headless individual. And I'm going to have to ask for technical help from about now, because there's a video which apparently is going to be difficult to work. If the enemy in Kokoschka's case was the grotesque simulacrum of the lover who had jilted him and destroyed their unborn child, Eileen Eger's bejeweled, blindfolded, and disembodied head in this Angel of Anarchy strikes out against the classical and more masculine order, asserting what she described as a feminine type of imagination. But the evil of the inhuman bloodlessness of the assembly line goddess, the display mannequin, is perhaps most powerfully explored in the Dada artist Hans Richter's 1947 experimental film, The Dreams That Money Can Buy, of which I was hoping slickly to show you a clip, but that's not going to work.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. There's one last image on there, though. I'll keep going so we don't waste too much time. Richter went a step further, inverting the destructive gender roles and setting mannequins on themselves so that the notionally enamored male becomes the victim, cast off and destroyed by the unfeeling female, the girl with the prefabricated heart, as she's called.
He left him bereft and wifeless, and he fell to the ground. Right? Life.
So, next one, thanks. Uh-oh. It's a shame, it would have ended quite well. That's all right. Right, okay. So much more evocative and haunting then against this background of artifice and atrocity, the headless mannequin in a piece from McQueen's Silent Rape collection. A phantasmic figure which the Imagine tells us roams the field of battle on which in 1746 man, like mannequin, sought vengeance on their own kind. Thank you.
And the gadgets over there. Yeah.
I think a bit. I'll try not to say anything rude.
Oh, well, wonderful.
Well, I can't see anything, but anyway, let's go.
Mine working? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very happy to be chairing a discussion with Kees, is it Van der Graaf? I hope
Yes.
I'm pronouncing correctly, designer, and Laura Morgan, also now costume designer, but was a model and particularly fit model for McQueen. So we have some images which I gave Kees the job of being in charge of.
Can you see it in that monitor behind?
Oh yes, I can see that. Okay. So I hope it'll be very informal and that there'll be time for some questions. And for me, the most exciting thing is really hearing from both of you about your experiences. And I wondered, I don't know if we can get up the picture of Laura's body cast.
Here, is
that the one? Do I have to do it?
There you go.
Oh, that's not it. The problem is I don't actually know what's on
Here, there. Look
Here we
straight
are.
ahead.
We can see you.
Okay, thank you. See, I'm cracked. No, but I actually
Right,
want
I can
Teamwork.
pass them on.
I want the actual modelling, not the...
I'll go a bit forward.
Oh, the other way.
There we are.
That'll do. Yeah, that's good. So maybe we could just start with that summer day, so many
Hot
years
summer
ago.
day.
A hot summer day, when Alexander McQueen commissioned you to make a body cast of you. Maybe, Kees, tell us the story.
Well, Lee had been down to the Queen Mary Hospital in Roehampton, and he was very inspired by the technicians there, especially the specialists in leather work. And he asked me to go down there and take a look around. And it was one of the most memorable visits that I have ever made to any technician's workshop. Absolutely vast. And what you first see is all the plaster casts on the shelves. Endless plaster casts. Lisa Skog yesterday, you would remember talking about the Cabinet of Curiosities, and it was a little bit like that, I was telling her, because every amputee has obviously a unique stump, and the stump has to be cast. And so the amputee can leave them to get on with that for a few weeks. And then when they come back for the trial fitting, then the prosthetic limb is built around that plaster cast. Now, the plaster cast, of course, is very, very important. And Lee said, make a plaster around Laura Morgan. And Laura was one of Lee's favorite models. And he sent Laura around, and one hot summer's day, we were stirring the plaster, and Lee was making sure that I would get the... You see, we weren't talking in terms of torsos. The talk we just had now, but made a distinction between torsos, mannequins, and androids. And we were more in tune with the idea of androids, because there is that difference between the cold torso, which is obviously lifeless, and what we were working with was more to do with bringing the torso to life as an android. And later on, when I was working with Givenchy, I did those LED pieces which have often been referred to as androids, and I was very pleased about that, because I don't think of myself as working in a lifeless medium. So that day, Laura and I will never forget. What's so important in making plaster casts, the process is called life casting, is that you need to stir the plaster very, very well. And if you see in the hallway outside, there's an interesting glass cabinet, and it's titled Process. Have a look there in the break, because you can see a face, and then next to it, there's a vac form And so the idea that Lee had for me was to make the plaster casts so that not only were the leather workers at Roehampton able to make their prosthetic leather work on that, but also that later on I could do the vac forming in exactly the same way as in that glass cabinet. It's quite a clear demonstration of how you work from a plaster cast to a vac form. And you know, you can see also, number one, you've got the negative. Obviously, I had to take a negative off Laura's body, and then when I took that negative back to the studio, then I would make a positive. So all the torsos you see on the images here, they're all positives.
So could we maybe just pause there and ask Laura what was her experience of being of that, and then we can go on to how the mould was used, perhaps. What do you remember? Did you volunteer?
No, I kind of did. I remember, I mean, that was one thing about working with Lee and his team. It was always like, oh, you'll be up for it. You're up for doing it. And the great thing was being able to work with people like Keith and go through all these different experiences. So I met Keith, and I remember how hot it was and wanting to have fans there. And then I think, Keith, you said you'd never done this before. There was some kind of like,
we've never done the whole body.
Not the whole body, that was it.
No, because it takes a whole day. It was something like
So was your whole body cast?
Well, yeah, we had a bit of a calamity, didn't we? We tried. Keith was like, do you want to try and...
I can explain. You see, what a lot of people don't realize is that there's a limited amount of time, and Lee was giving us, kept reminding us that we needed to get these plaster casts down to Roehampton as quickly as possible. There wasn't a lot of time. Roehampton needed 5 weeks, and that leather work, literally they have to beat the leather onto the plaster. The plaster has to be rock hard. The leather is wet when they work on it, and they were delighted with the plaster casts that I had made with Laura because they were very, very rock solid. But it did take 5 weeks, so there was pressure. We had to do all that work in one day, and because of the pressure, we were speeding things up. And
we tried to do
because
too much,
we tried to do it so quickly,
I'd nearly fainted.
It
there
started to get hot.
There was a point where and you always want to kind of support the process, and everybody was very supportive there. And I remember just standing there and looking at Keith going, oh, well, I've got to sit down. It was like, no!
But you can't.
But
you can't, because you have to stand rock solid.
Laura had to stand there through the whole process. We were running around. Thing is, if anyone else wants to start to try live casting, just take it easy. Take it stage by stage.
Did I have to lie down at one point? Do I remember that? Yeah, I think that's how we got the
That's
front
right.
of
It's
my
always
leg.
wonderful when you start off because the plaster is a bit warm
and then
you
it
put it on the body.
Seize
then
up,
it
so it starts to seize up
with an
around your body.
exothermic
Actually,
reaction.
Rebecca Lowthorpe, who modelled that rough cast early corset that Jane showed, described how it was so heavy once it was on her.
It's very heavy.
She had to lie down before the show because she couldn't physically support it.
Yeah,
she could only just support it enough for the duration.
And it's very bizarre having that feeling on your body as well. And it's very hot, and then it starts to go cold, and then it starts to get heavy, and then you feel really faint.
And then you feel faint. So
especially when you're like, I can't move.
How different does it feel to, say, wearing one of the showpieces that you wore that were also quite encasing?
No, the
straining?
showpieces, but the showpieces weren't as heavy as that, and also I could move my legs, which was a bonus. But and I think I'd worked with Sean so many times to get the fit right, and it had been a process with him, and by that point, from being with Lee for like a year, then I was used to being strapped in and pulled as tight as possible, and figuring out and actually moving in the pieces and figuring out if it was actually physically possible to walk, and then how that would restrict the models in the show. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting hearing that, because Lee did walk models round. You'd always
Yeah.
get a chance to walk round the runway, but I never did because I was being screwed into pieces like this, or with the glass piece, they were too frightened for me to go out twice, so I only got to go out once. And this one in particular, there was ice, because it had ice skaters. There was ice in the middle, and Sean would always walk me up before I had to go out, and he'd be like, "Don't, it's all right, babe, you know, don't worry, but stick to the side because there's ice in the middle." And it was like, what? And all the lights. And this is actually really my first show that I ever did, big show as a model, so it was just doubly terrifying.
But you can see how beautifully it fits Laura's body, and that's simply
Amazing.
because it was made from Laura's body.
Yeah.
And
you did a very good job. Apart from my bum is bigger than
Even
on that.
after
And it
it
actually
fell
was
apart.
because I had to sit down.
And in fact, in the catalogue, they're shown side by side. You can see the corset next to the mould, so you can make
There's
that
two
visible.
very talented people and very precise as well. Very precise.
And then maybe we could move on to talk about the rock crystal corset, which Case you made and also you modelled, that came after that, didn't it?
yes,
What
in
was
fact,
the request to you for that? I think we might have a picture of it, but I haven't seen this PowerPoint, so I don't know.
I'll just go.
There it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm looking
So-
really happy. Not impressed. It's probably about 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
Yeah, working with Lee, you end up very often working at 4 o'clock in the morning or through the night.
Yeah.
And Katie England remembers that. She was the one that I worked a lot with because Lee and Katie England had a very, very close relationship, and we all know that Katie England is an absolutely fabulous stylist. And so it was a very, very brief conversation, in fact, that I had with Lee. He asked me, how about crystal bodice? And the beauty of working with Lee, from my point of view, was that although sometimes he would be very, very specific about how to cut fabric, he thought of me as somebody who worked with plastics, really, and that was a different field. In a way, he treated me in the same way as Sean Lean. Sean Lean did the coils, and Lee just let Sean do what he was good at as a jeweler. Sean and Lee were very, very good friends. And Lee let me do what we thought was best. He was really, really wonderful in that way. So when Laura came to do the, you can see on the left, that's part finished. It's at the studio. You can see the crystals are just down the front, and they haven't been put on the sides yet. So it's not finished. You can see on the right, on the overlook, that's the complete piece. But the joke of it is that Lee, I discovered later on, was thinking that I would be doing them out of Swarovski crystals. And I misinterpreted him, so he gave me that opportunity. There was that room for maneuverability that I grabbed, went off the next day down to the Rock Warehouse in Hackney, and bought, it must have been 600 quid's worth of rock crystals. I was especially attracted with the needle crystals for the shoulders, and we spent a night, we had to work through the night, putting those crystals on a fiberglass bodice that I had, fiberglass torso that I had made from Laura's torso. But it was a position where we were in such short, we didn't have enough time to like the other pieces that Lee did, for instance, all the feathers, they were meticulously sewn on. For weeks and weeks they were sewing all those beautiful little feathers on. But we did this all in one night. And because during the day we were working on site at the Overlook, and that was weeks and weeks of work. You can see on the side, just on that photograph, that side, on all that perspex, we had built ourselves through the night again. So there wasn't a lot of time to do that, and I was just delighted to get that wonderful collection of crystals to build that.
Do you remember wearing it? Because it's the same show as the quill corset, isn't it? You had two really great pieces.
Yeah, I didn't wear that because it took 15 minutes to get into the corset. And I actually I met up with Sean a month ago, and he reminded me that at the end of the show, when I was wearing the corset, everyone was celebrating, and he just walked off, and I couldn't move, and I was stuck in this thing. And luckily, he remembered at some point to come back and unscrew me out of it. It's just funny because I actually didn't remember until I saw this picture that I fitted this piece, because the thing for me as a fit model, and really kind of there from the beginning designs all the way through, is I tried on every single piece that was in the show and didn't make it into the show. So that is hundreds of pieces of clothing. But from seeing this, I remember how heavy it was, and also there being a worry that you wouldn't be able to get it finished in time.
Well, in fact, you gave me some good advice. You told me, make sure you put plenty of foam on the shoulders.
Without deep voice.
Because it was on a lot of... because of the weight. I mean, there's kilos of weight there. I mean, I remember coming back from Rock Warehouse, it was 2 big crates. And there was a lot of weight. But I think that's what's
so important about... I mean, I feel Lee, as you talked about earlier, was very much about character and his clothes coming to life. And I think that's what's, not to say about myself, but any kind of fit model or model, you have to try on all these pieces of clothing to understand what fits right, how it feels, how it moves. And also, luckily for me to be able to work with Lee, it was like even in the when we were fitting, to be able to put them on and always having to walk in them, and Lee was very much like, stand straight, be fierce. You took on a character. It was, I mean, it's fantastic.
And would he suggest to you a character, or was that what you brought to it?
I think I did. I brought that to it, which is why I love working with Lee.
And would he talk to you and other models about the concept for the show?
Sometimes. I mean, the clown one I was in, and I had no idea there was a merry-go-round on the stage. I had absolutely... It was like, okay, guess we're going to get on it. This piece is one of my favourite pieces. That was a collaboration with, again, with Sean and Lee. And I also fainted in this, because I was very much up for it, and I wanted it to be what Lee wanted, and the whole team, because everybody worked as a team. It was such an amazing environment to be in. And this was, again, like, how small can we get her waist? How small? We're like, keep going. And then I went over. And then put it back on. But I remember all the fittings that we'd done in London, those spears, we only had the corset and we hadn't finished the spears, and the spears actually screwed into the front of the corset and came out the back. But it was always our understanding that it would be a train behind me, and that the spears would just be on their own. And when we got to Paris in the final fitting, the night before the show, Lee was like, oh, let's try it on the end of the spears. And then everything, because of the weight of that fabric, everything lifted up backwards. And Lee just looked at Sean and went, you just fix it, you can do it. And and then walked off, and that's kind of what it was like. So you're like, okay, well, yeah, let's do it.
And I guess, were there times when people couldn't fix it?
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
But I suspect that may be why he worked with you all, because you did.
We all just did it. And everybody really, there was such a good energy there. And again, Katie was fantastic. Sarah, obviously, was amazing. And everybody was involved in the process. And he leaned on people a lot and asked their advice. I remember one time, because I also did a lot of the commercial fittings, and it was quite hard because at that point, like, you go from the show, which is very much kept in-house and controlled, by Lee and by the team. And when it comes to more like the selling pieces, you have to send those, not the show pieces, but things that were in the show out to Italy to be made. And no disrespect to them, but they'd often come back completely different. And I remember very particularly when we were doing the jeans, that they'd made this delivery at great expense, and the Italians being there, and Lee just going, oh no, and just getting scissors and cutting up the front of the jeans and slashing it, and that kind of actually ended up being sold in stores. So, yeah, it was very interesting because we were all very, very creative, and he was very much in the mind of you can do it, and was rebellious in that way.
Do you think, because as a fit model, you see the whole gamut, don't you? You see every bit of the design process, from the more conceptual to the entirely commercial to when the samples come back from the factory. But given that you now work as a costume designer, is it for film mostly?
Film and film music, and I also do styling.
Do you think you learnt a lot from this?
Oh, hugely. And you were actually, I went to St. Martin's just for a summer when I decided I didn't want to model, and Caroline actually taught me pattern cutting.
No, I didn't. We were on the course together.
Oh, I thought you taught me. Oh, no, it was Louise.
It was Louise. No, what it was I thought, if you write about clothes, you need to understand about construction, and I can sew, but I can't pattern cut.
Thought you
No, I did that course. And actually, it was like, it was a really good sort of, I didn't plan this, but it really kind of stood me in good stead with the design tutors, because I think until then they thought I was a complete egghead.
Yeah.
And then I could do pattern cutting, and they went, oh, Caroline, you're really brilliant. Which actually I wasn't, but it was the fact that I could do it.
Certainly sold it.
So that was how we met. We were both kind of pupils together.
God, sorry, I totally thought you
in
taught
the old
me.
building.
I have a huge regard for you, so that we immediately...
I'd love to be able to teach pattern cutting, but actually I'm really very average at it.
But
anyway,
I did learn a lot, and I said to you earlier, I didn't realise how much I had learned until I went and did fashion courses. I mean, I think by putting on the clothes, and I'm sure everybody knows when you put on clothes, you kind of you feel like, if only I could take the waist in here and the fit, and because of Lee's level of meticulousness. I remember him fitting a pair of pants on me and actually like kneeling down on the floor and just working for, not hours, but for a long time trying to get the pitch absolutely perfect. And, and having to start, absolutely amazing. So I learned a huge amount from him.
It's very interesting the way that both of you talk. I think there's a balance between a kind of obsessive perfectionism of just getting it right that is extraordinary to combine with a slightly ad hoc, flying by the skin of your pants nature.
Complete rebellion.
And also just pulling stuff together just at the moment of a show.
Yeah.
It's unusual,
especially if you're privileged to be in the rehearsals and also the last few minutes before the models go up onto the catwalk, there is just, all kinds of sellotape and last-minute adjustments.
Well, I was supposed to go out, this piece actually has blood on its hem because I wish I could remember her name, she's fantastic. She was literally stitching it all through the night until I put it on. It was like, throw it on her, and her blood is on the end. And then I was supposed to wear these absolutely enormous platform shoes. And as you can see, one wolf is terrified, and it tried to wrap itself around my leg most of the time, and the other one was freaked out and trying to pull me down. And I said, there's no way I can go out in those heels. I can either fall over or I can walk. So they sawed off the heels for me.
So you must be the only person allowed out in flats.
Yeah, well, I was like, I'm not doing it.
And that was all last minute.
I was up for a lot of things, but I would have ruined it.
Yeah. And was it this one show? There was a fire backstage.
That was the Overlook.
Was that the Overlook?
They had the snow machine. We were all getting dressed. No, the snow machine, the pipe was separated from where it was supposed to be going onto the stage, and there was just snow exploding all over the back of the stage, and then somebody had left their sweater on a pipe, electrical cable, so that was going on the snow, and then there was a fire, and Sean and I were screwing me into my thing, so it was fine. We were in a corner.
Should we maybe move, because we slightly went Overlook?
Yeah, I just went forward to Overlook with Amy Mullins, And but I'll go back to where we
Maybe
were.
you're vac forming, I don't know. There we go.
Yeah, that's
Is that the mirror?
vac forming. And again, you can see outside in that glass cabinet. Lee thought of me as the Perspex specialist, and I do love Perspex, and he loved the transparency of it, and he went on to the other transparent materials which he loved, like water, ice, which again, he was the one who asked me about doing a Perspex ice rink for the Overlook, and I told him that you're probably going to get problems with the ice skaters getting their blades stuck between the sheets of Perspex. And so he said, well, Christ, what are we going to do? I said, wait, I'll give you a call tomorrow. And that night, I looked through in those days it was the Yellow Pages, I'm afraid, and I found the guy under it wasn't I for ice, it was in another section. I found some guy who does the ice rinks, and I told him to hire him, and they came and put the plastic film all over the floor. And it was only a few days before the Overlook show, and then he flooded it with water. He had all the freezer elements laid out on the floor inside the plastic wall, and then I was there when he switched on. All the elements went on, and in about 3 hours, the water froze. And Katie England, her mouth just fell open. She was delighted. Then she called up the professional ice skaters to try it out, just to make sure it did work. And but then Lee said, "Hey, the models are worried about slipping on the ice. And what can we do?" And this was the last day before the show, and he said, "Just throw some sheets on the floor." I had to go back to the studio, get some sheets of Perspex quickly, threw them on the ice, on the outside, so that the girls could go on the inside ice. And we put the artificial snow over the Perspex so that the models wouldn't slip on the Perspex. Because all these last-minute decisions had to be made. So really, really, although Lee was, as you say, a perfectionist, a lot was left to chance. But that, in a way, is how you can judge a great person, literally how many risks is he prepared to take.
And I think he really trusted everyone as well.
He did.
His team, everyone around him.
I was
he
so
really
honoured to
trusts
have that
people's
trust.
abilities.
And it is a live performance, isn't it?
Yeah.
As well, it's part of that.
So as I was saying, Perspex was my speciality, and that's what he thought of me, Mr. Perspex. But in fact, I also loved working with vac forming, and vac forming is great, but Perspex is a little bit difficult to do with vac forming, and PET-G is a whole lot better. If I throw this bottle on the floor full of water, it won't break because it is PET-G. If you look on the bottom of these bottles, you'll see a PET, which is what... So we were working with PET.
Which is a plastic, essentially.
It is a sheet plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to slightly
Okay.
fast forward you. But no, finish what you were saying, but I'm just...
No,
I'm conscious
it's just
there's
that
a lunch
vac forming is what he, wanted me to do. And all these bodices, you can see there is one. And those were the torsos. Now, the one on the left is really interesting because that's Erin O'Connor wearing the butterflies. It's one of the PET-G bodices I made off Laura's body torso. But Erin's best friend is Jodie, and I made a plaster cast of Jodie Kidd's back. So it was a bit Frankenstein-esque because I had Laura's body full on the front and Jodie's back all worn by Erin O'Connor with the body.
I'm not sure you can top that anecdote.
I didn't tell Lee that.
I think that's so mind-blowing. Maybe I think that we have to stop, unfortunately. We've got two.
I'll tell you very quickly. In the middle, you can see that the former. That's at my studios, and you can see the former with the PET G stretched over flat, and then you warm it up, and then you suck it down onto the body, onto the negative.
Thank you so much. Matty? Okay, right, so that's it. Okay, that's cool. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so that'd be okay. Next to my Oyster card. That'd be okay. I'm going to just fly into it.
Different with your grip.
For something completely
Now
different.
for something completely different.
My God. Do I have a... Is there a clicker? Oh, yeah. Shall I just launch off? Yeah. Yes. Fly. Good afternoon, everyone. Now for something completely different. My name is Keith Lodwick. I'm one of the curators in theatre and performance. And myself and my colleague, Jane Pritchard, are going to be talking about the theatrical element between now and lunchtime of Lee McQueen's work. In the last couple of years, theatre and performance have had a very sort of strong presence in its exhibitions at the V&A. Jane's fantastic Diaghilev and the Gordon Age of the Ballet-Russe exhibition on a few years ago. I worked on the Hollywood costume exhibition, and then David Bowie have all been breaking records. But I think we're probably going to be eclipsed, all of us, by the current Savage Beauty show, which is breaking all records. And it was fascinating. That's why these days are so brilliant. It was fascinating hearing Jane's talk about mannequins, because mannequins are always a huge challenge for us as curators, and when we're displaying clothes and costumes. And it's great that a colleague from Textile Conservation at the V&A and the Mounting Department is also here, because when you're thinking about film costume shows or theatre costume shows or dance costume shows, you're completely taking away the clothes, the costumes, away from the original context in which they've been designed and putting them on plinths, on mannequins, devoid of any contextual information. So it's a real challenge. So we're always trying to find new ways of how to display objects. So that was fascinating, Jane. And when Claire and her team first asked me to talk a bit about the theatrical costumiers, Bermans and Nathans, which Lee worked for in the late 80s, I was really delighted. And it's great to see Claire. Welcome back. Hope you're feeling better. Nice to have you with us. Because it was very much an area of his life that hadn't really been documented before. It was kind of part of the creative jigsaw puzzle that was slightly sort of missing. This theatrical costumiers, very grand, old traditional theatrical costumiers, and what kind of role they played, what influence they had later on in his collections. And this commission really engaged me to look at the role of the costume house and the role it plays in theatre and film and opera and the fashion industry, and how they all really interweave and sort of interconnect with one another. And I'm just going to briefly tell a quick story about how a costume transfers itself from film to performer to to pop star to museum, and then how it's sort of commercialized. This is David Hemming in the 1968 film The Charge of the Light Brigade, and the costume was made at Berman's and Nathan's. Adamant, the pop star Adamant, continually spent 5 years hiring the costume from Berman's, because once the film is made, the costume goes back into stock, and it sits there, and it can be hired by anyone, by me, by any of you. Adamant went to Berman's, would continually would rehire the costume again and again and again, and eventually they just gave it to him. So he then appears on Top of the Pops. It becomes a costume probably most associated with him, and then eventually it ends up in the V&A's collection on a mannequin. And if you've got $500 spare, you can go on a website called thejacketcompany.com and buy your own copy, which is called the Adamant Jacket. So it's a very fascinating transference of an object from film to pop star to museum, and how it's sort of commercialized. It's very much part of this kind of story. But I'm coming back to Berman's and Nathan's. I just want to paint a very, very quick painting for you about this world, the theatrical world that he worked in. First of all, a very, very quick history lesson. The Nathan's part of Berman's and Nathan's was actually founded in 1790, and throughout the 19th century was intrinsically linked with the boom in theatre building in the West End. It had a number of premises around the West End, near the Theatre or Drury Lane at one point, in Panton Street, near the Haymarket Theatre or Haymarket, and it very much prided itself on its clientele. Charles Dickens was a customer. It would costume the D'Oyly Carte productions. There was connections with the royal family and the tableau vivants that were very popular at the end of the 19th century, where people were sort of creating a living, sort of paintings using costume. And it was a high end, had a very, very excellent quality in its costume construction. Remember that costume houses were always a mix of historical costumes, sometimes handed on, inherited, and then made. So you have all this mix thrown in together. The Berman's element. Berman was founded in 1884 by a Russian emigre, Max Berman, but it was his son Monty Berman that really expanded the company in the 20th century, and they are very, very closely associated with film. Berman's really designed and worked with costume designers and costumed virtually every major film production right throughout the latter half of the 20th century. So all the great sort of war epics, Lawrence of Arabia, The Charge of the Light Brigade, even Star Wars. So it had a very, very strong military element, Berman's, because it actually began as a military tailors. You could effectively outfit any garrison from any history from these collections. In 1972, the two companies merged to become Berman's and Nathan's, and they moved to Camden into a 5-story warehouse. And at that point, they really owned probably over, no one really knows exactly how much, but probably over 1 million costumes. So for any costume designer, any researcher, it was a really unique environment in which to go to. So outside of an historical collection in a museum, you could go, you could walk down the aisles, you could see this material firsthand and really sort of study it and understand it. So in the late 1980s, this is the world that Lee McQueen entered. He began working in 1988 at Berman's and Nathan's in North Camden. So remember that it was packed with every major style, every single period, and every single movement. So there were 2 production departments at Berman's and Nathan's. There was the men's stock, where designers would come and outfit a film or TV or opera or theatre, and then there was men's production. And Lee was based in the men's production department. Remember, he'd been at Savile Row at this point. And he's working as an assistant tailor. He was trained by somebody called Frank Davidson, who had started his career at Berman's and then had gone over to the National Theatre and become head of men's tailoring there. And it was Frank that trained Lee. And I think what excites fashion historians and academics probably the most is the contribution that Lee made to the epic musical Les Miserables. That was then, remember, it was then in its 4th year. It had opened in the mid-80s, had been running for 4 years in London, had opened on Broadway, had opened in Europe. And so the costumes in the production were being remade, restyled, there were cast changes, and they were always being developed. So Lee was working on Les Mis. Now remember that he is really now a costume interpreter. That's a key thing to remember, that he is interpreting other people's work. In this case, the costume designer Adrien Neofitu, who designed the original production of Les Mis. But he's working very closely with the tailors, and he's creating jackets, waistcoats, and frock coats for the various characters. Remember that Les Mis really runs over a very, very long period in French history. During this research process, because virtually none of Berman's and Nathan's archives exist, the company doesn't exist anymore. It's been swallowed up by a much larger company, which I'll come to at the very end. So it doesn't exist. So I was able to interview 2 of his former colleagues, somebody called Lee Tassie, and the 2 Lees befriended each other and would go out clubbing together. And also I interviewed somebody called Michael O'Connor, who's now an Academy Award-winning costume designer, who actually began on the same day as Lee at Berman's and Nathan's. And Michael has some very interesting things to say about working with Lee. Often after work, they'd go to the Wimpy on Camden High Street for a hamburger. What Michael sort of says was about Lee was very, very interesting to what sort of comes next. We were both young and to some extent wide-eyed, especially me. I was from a working class background like Lee. And at Berman's in the late 80s, you had every major Hollywood film actor or actress coming through the doors. One day we'd see Faye Dunaway, the next you'd see Harrison Ford in the fitting room. And in between tailoring duties, Lee would like to explore the costume stock. He would walk down the aisles and aisles and aisles, looking at the 17th and 18th century frock coats, jackets. He would take them off the hangers. He would turn them inside out. He would look at the construction, where the stitching lies. He would almost want to really sort of take them apart and put them back together again. And he spent a long time doing this. It was a very hierarchical organization, Berman's and Nathan's. It was all male in the men's workshop department. And they addressed one another with the formal Mr. in front of your Christian name. So he was known as Mr. Lee. And Michael actually equates this experience, and some of you might be a little young to remember the BBC sitcom, Are You Being Served? Anyway, look at it on YouTube and you might see this is kind of the environment that Lee is in. So he possibly didn't feel that comfortable, which has been written about in The Savage Beauty, in the book that accompanies the exhibition. But the experience of being at Berman's, I really think we can see those influences later on in his career. And at one stage, he is working on this coat. It's for the actor Richard Harris for a film largely forgotten now called King of the Wind. But he's creating this frock coat, and it's obviously quite a key piece for him because during the research element at the V&A, Kate and Louise were able to access Lee's portfolio for Central St. Martin's, and he photographed the coat he was working on and used this pattern taken from a V&A book, 1790 book, the cut of English clothing. So it was obviously a key element that he was working in and very much sort of learning from. And as we go on and move through Lee's career, you begin to see the influences hopefully, the influences of what it was like working at these very grand theatrical costumiers, the kinds of things he was learning about creating clothes for stage and screen. And I want to dispel a myth, if I can, that theatre clothing has to be robust. There's a common myth that it doesn't have to be properly made because it doesn't have to last. Well, it does. Remember that actors are working in cramped conditions backstage. There are costume changes. They have to endure sweat and very, very hot lights. Plays, musicals can run for a long, long time. So the clothing has to be robust. It has to be well made. And Berman's really prided itself on the couture level. It would state in its documentation and its publicity that it was that couture level that costumes are made for. So he was getting this fantastic experience working with the tailors who had worked on the kinds of films such as those kind of war epics, and Berman's also created the entire James Bond catalogue. So he was getting this terrific experience. So we see those influences of the frock coats sort of subverted in collections such as Dante and The Girl That Lived in a Tree. And it's very interesting now to compare the coat he made for Richard Harris as King George II with this coat from the collection from I. And I suppose one of his most famous collaborations would be with David Bowie and the distressed frock coat he made for his tour, the Earthling tour, and the cover of the album, which was then featured in the David Bowie's exhibition. In the recent Savage Beauty book, the McQueen book at the V&A, Lee eventually somewhat dismissed the experience at Berman's and Nathan's, but I really like what Chris Breward, you would have heard him speak yesterday if you were at the V&A, I really like what he wrote about that. He says, but while the backstage campness, remember I said that Lee possibly felt like he didn't perhaps fit in at Berman's, was discarded as worthless, the careful replication of historical dressmaking techniques captured his imagination and indeed seemed to haunt him. So I think we like to feel that theatricality that Lee was experiencing at Berman's eventually would reinvent itself later on in his career. I'm just going to finish there. Berman's and Nathan's doesn't exist anymore. It was consumed by Angels. The Nathan's element was dropped and it became Berman's and Angels. Eventually it just is known as Angels. So that big, vast collection of costumes does exist in some form. It's in a huge warehouse in North London. They don't actually know how many costumes they have in the collection now. Michael O'Connor, who befriended Lee at Berman's, when after Lee left, he didn't see him for many years and only saw him once in a crowded bar. And they clocked one another. They didn't speak, as if to say, they nodded, as if to say, we were Berman's boys, which is rather a nice quote. I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, Jane Pritchard. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Right, well, thank you very much, and it's a great privilege to follow on from Keith. I'm talking about dance, and again, I'm talking to give something of a context, I think, to the small amount of work that is ostensibly dance in McQueen's work. I think there's a great deal of dance that doesn't get acknowledged in many ways, and I just love this image that I've got on the screen for you to start with. It's a wonderful photo of late McQueen, really. I look at it and I see dance. I see dance in the stillness of some of the photographs. I see dance very definitely through the way a lot of the elements are staged. And I think it's sort of quite interesting that yesterday in the afternoon, when the things were being talked about, the obvious element of theatricality came through. In every sense, everyone has talked about the theatricality of McQueen's work. In terms of being asked for words to sum up, one word to sum up his output, I was struck by two: transformation and fluidity. And I think that the fluidity comes there. I see this picture and instantly, and this shows how obsessed I am with dance, I think of a work called Errant, created in 1933. Now, I didn't actually see it myself, but it was to do with flowing fabrics. It was to do with playing with light on fabric. It comes out of a long line from Loie Fuller, so Chelyshev picks up on some of those ideas and moves it forward. And I think with McQueen's work, there's something that one must sort of say, that he was, I mean, Keith has talked about him going through the racks and that sort of magpie building up of information, the building up of storyboards at every opportunity behind sort of creations. And I think that one can see that very often it's not necessarily you pinpoint that is precisely where it's come from in terms of the idea, but one is aware that a lot of ideas are there, they're sort of floating around in the background, and I think sort of actually being sort of very important about. So the infiltration of ideas, and those include, I think, ideas from the dance world, even if they weren't sort of acknowledged, even if as McQueen said, he had very little interest in theatre and dance. Well, he didn't. Of course he didn't. But what I think he rebelled against was that sort of elitist impression that came through. And, of course, film was very much more his world. So just to give you a sort of sense of context, an enormous number of fashion designers have moved into the world of dance, some of them very briefly. They just design one production, or they design one production in a decade. So there's not a great deal. It's not that they're trying to sort of take over another world, but it's another opportunity. It's a way to sort of create ideas. And certainly the Ballet Russe is something that, you know, I defy any art student in any form not to have found some impact that comes through from there. So I've just picked up here two elements to give the sort of symbiosis that comes through. With the Poiret fashion item there, Poiret actually dressed one of the dancers on many occasions, Tamara Kasavina, but he then also took inspiration from one of the costumes he wore and turned that into a fashion, which is exactly the same sort of element that you're going to get through in sort of the McQueen world. And then, of course, the most famous of the couturiers, Coco Chanel, working on Tremblay, but also as an advisor on costumes, so very much somebody behind the scenes and contributing to a number of productions, although it's only Tremblay for which she actually designs all the costumes. And I put there designs were clothes for. She was picking up very much on the fashions of the day, using those. Okay, the bathing costumes, I think, filtered through the Annette Kellerman experience of the bathing costume on stage, so not just coming from the world of fashion, but she was somebody who would contribute to a number of different productions. And the idea of using clothes rather than costumes is again something that comes through. When Catherine Hamnett, for example, designed or was asked to design strong language in the 80s, she took actually clothes off the rail from her collections and said, right, then these are what I want, and the credit must be clothes, not costumes. But there is a very long and ongoing tradition that comes through. So here's just three designers working for the stage. Yves Saint Laurent returned a number of times. Lacroix, still absolutely fascinated by the stage, and not only by actually designing for the stage, but also he's somebody who's very heavily involved actually in displaying those costumes afterwards. He works quite extensively with the Costume Centre at Moulin on a number of their exhibitions that are really focused on his output. But it's not only abroad, it's something that's sort of seen a great deal in this country too. At Rambert, for example, in the 1980s, just into the early 90s, when Richard Alston was the artistic director, there was a deliberate move to involve fashion designers in working for the stage. And it's very interesting because when you're working for dance in particular, one has to be very sensitive to the movement, to how the body moves. I mean, I'm sorry, those sort of encasing corset outfits would not work very effectively for most choreographers. And choreographers will either work with the designer, with the fashion artist, if necessary, and so they work together on a very close collaboration, or you will find, in a way, the designer comes along and decorates afterwards. The most successful ones, of course, are the former. And I always think the production, the image, see this slide here. Oops, sorry, wrong pointer. This one, which was Merce Cunningham company performing, the sort of way that was actually just sort of taking off the sort of the catwalk from the body meets the dress meets the body, the sort of sense of actually distorting the body, but still enabling it to move very effectively. Usually if you distort the body, you run into problems with the movement. But here was an occasion when it was really made to work, absolutely sort of fascinating. But moving closer to the McQueen world, with Michael Clark sort of coming into play. From very early on, he was involving very interesting designers, going to Body Map, using Lee Bowery. And along with Lee Bowery, one also gets the involvement, of course, of Mr. Pearl. So with a lot of the costumes from sort of Bowery and Pearl, you will get that whole sort of sense that is also evident, we saw earlier this morning, the sense of masking the face. A work, for example, that Mr. Pearl was responsible for, that Matthew Hawkins did, called Jupiter is Crying. The heads were totally distorted by having sort of little cones underneath, and then the whole face was actually veiled or masked. Yes, you could see out. As we mentioned, the problems of actually being able to see where you're going is very important, and of course that's even more important if you're dancing and dancing with people. So there is that sort of sense, but I used the image there of Mr. Pearl wearing the McQueen outfit from Birds that we saw yesterday, actually in movement, because I think that whole sort of fascination with distorting the body in terms of himself, in who he worked with, and then taking that into the theatre is actually sort of quite a fascinating sort of subject. So to move on sort of more closely to where dance actually is acknowledged in the sort of catwalk show. I think, of course, we were hearing about the ice rink and the skating. Just remember that was basically ice dance that was coming in there. So, as I say, there's quite often references to dance that perhaps are not sort of emphasised as much. So here we have the image of They Shoot Horses, Don't They, with Jane Fonda. We saw the clip from that yesterday. And then basically how it was treated by McQueen and Clark. Now, I think actually the sort of collaboration between the two is quite interesting. And I'm very, very struck by the fact that one of the things that Michael Clark emphasised, they weren't particularly close friends. They met each other through the clubbing scene. And, of course, Michael Clark, very much an iconic figure in the dance world, particularly in the sort of 90s, coming through with his own company, doing all sorts of wonderfully wacky things. But Michael Clark makes a very important observation about the two of them working together, and that is the fact that, apart from the fact they were both Scottish, and so they had that sort of link, also there was the sense that they both had a very, very firm background in formal classical training. So whether that was the tailoring of McQueen or the tailoring of McQueen or the background that Michael has. He was trained at the Royal Ballet School. He really fell in love with the training that had been established by Enrico Cocchetti at the beginning of the century, and he always uses that as the base for his company classes. So he is someone with a very strong background in a formal training. So they have that sense of actually sort of coming from a strong background and then becoming sort of much more anarchic in some senses, much more experimental, having sort of fun with what they're doing. But we did see a clip yesterday of the Deliverance and just another area here. So for this, it was a combination of dancers from Michael's company, dancers that were working on a freelance basis alongside the models. So working together, so taking things into a slightly different area, putting a great deal more focus on dance. Of course, the background to They Shoot Horses and therefore also the Deliverance show is very much this sort of sense in the American Depression, having the dance marathons where people would dance for days, literally days, and become increasingly exhausted. Michael, when asked about sort of working with and why they're working on this together, said, well, essentially it's about falling apart, and I was good at that. He also picked up on the reference saying that, of course, he was absolutely fascinated and had created his first version of The Rite of Spring, and that, of course, is something that's very much on the same sort of idea, dancing yourself to death, sort of coming through. So just a few images from that show, and then moving into the one sort of actual dance work within the theatre that McQueen was really involved with. I know it's going to be spoken about more this afternoon, so I can move through it here, I think, fairly quickly. But I do want to emphasise that this work really was a collaboration between 5 people. Sylvie Guillaume, who was the starting point for it, and you have your last chances to see her in performance. I know she's done her season at Sadler's Wells, but Coliseum's coming up at the end of July. And in today's paper, The Independent, talking about what a charisma she has. So she was the starting point. She had also been trained in sort of classical ballet. That was her background, having come from gymnastics initially. But she brought together the people who were going to work on this. So she talked to, firstly, Russell Malafant, another dancer, choreographer, who shared her background of having trained in sort of ballet and then stepped outside that sort of safe field to experiment and take on new dance techniques. And I think this is the thing, both of them fascinated in enlarging their vocabulary, experimenting and trying. And both wanted to work with Robert Lepage, so when Sylvie had the chance to sort of meet up, sorry, I misspelt her name there, sort of saying, right, then, you know, we want to work with you. But he didn't realise that they intended he was going to be on stage with them. Obviously not dance trained, but going sort of, that doesn't matter. Not in this sort of work when you're sort of working together, but bringing a lot of ideas. Of course, with Russell, you acquire Michael Hulls as the lighting designer, absolutely brilliant lighting designer, who will really enhance any dancer's work. And they decided, or Sylvie decided, it'd be a good idea to invite McQueen to design it, in spite of knowing that he really wasn't interested. He, of course, was aware of Sylvie and her extraordinary body and also her extraordinary way of movement, and so agreed to do it. But I think it's sort of really quite important to sort of think about why. He's somebody who said, no, I don't want to do it, but the actual work, the ideas behind the work, I think, were things that interested him. It's the idea behind the production is really twofold. Firstly, it's about the French chevalier Charles de Beaumont, the Chevalier d'Eon, hence the title, and it's also drawing on the sense of cross-dressing and changing gender, so referring also to the kabuki tradition of the men who actually play female roles. So combining those two words to create the title. It's one occasion when a title really tells you what you're in for, although most people have no idea what that's going to be. But the important thing is that the Chevalier, who lived in the 18th century, was somebody who was a spy who cross-dressed and a duelist. So not a very usual character, perhaps, for that time, or maybe there were more people cross-dressing then than we really know. But certainly for that sort of profile, and there was considerable speculation as to whether he was a man or a woman. But I think the things were that appealed to Lee, the historical referencing that could be brought in. So yes, you do have frock coats, you do have military jackets that sort of come through on that side of things, the cloaks and everything. You have the whole sense of transgender. You have this sense of transformation, very importantly, the male and the female morphing into one another. And I think there's also a dark melancholy to the work. So actually, it is a work that's actually very much to his style. Indeed, as he says, it was completely up his strasse, as is the title of this afternoon's presentation. So I think that was, sort of very much sort of bringing things on board. You had duels, you had work with fans. The dancers wore the crinolines that gave the sense of being caged, transformed and changed the body a great deal. A lot of it is based around really sort of vignettes. It was a fascinating work. I'm not certain it worked 100% in many ways, but I think one of the best descriptions that I know of it comes from Louise Levine, who described it, the highlights of it, in terms of Malenfant's pair work, because he basically did the choreography. Malenfant's pair work for himself and Guillaume inevitably provides the choreographic highlight. Their bodies seem to melt into one during the duets, with the most uncanny symbiosis. In the penultimate sequence, Malenfant's arms snake out from within her kimono, and together they create a four-armed, double-sexed creature, which really also related to the opening of the production. But there was this amazing sense of the two bodies actually really almost interchanging that came through very, very strongly with two really very fine performers. But as I say, we'll be hearing more about that this afternoon, so I should just nip on to the very final thing that I wanted to refer to, and that was Michael Clarke's other work with McQueen, another significant piece, and that came in black, so we're now sort of just a year after Deliverance, and sort of getting back on the catwalk. Michael himself performing alongside Kate Moss, and so although this film is in very poor condition, it is well worth having a look at. Oops, sorry, come on back. Where's me?
Baby was a black sheep, baby was a whore. Baby got big and baby gets bigger. Baby gets something, baby gets more. Baby was a rock and roll. Look around you, all around you. Riding on a cowboy wave. Do you like the world around you? Are you ready to be heard? Outside of society, they're waiting for me. Outside of society, that's where I wanna be. Lady! Baby was a black sheep, baby was a whore. You know she got big, well she's gonna get bigger. Baby got a hand, got a finger on the trigger. Baby is a rock and roll. Outside of society, that's where I wanna be. Outside of society, they're waiting for me.
Those who have suffered understand suffering. I think in that you can also see echoes of what he had done in Deliverance as well, but obviously a very sort of exciting moment. I'm sorry, I've rather sped through what I was going to sort of say because I know time is of the essence and we are running a bit late, but thank you very much.